Hello, young historians. Welcome to Learn Extra Matric Exam Revision. Today we'll be focusing on the Cold War. So what I'd like to do first, I'd like us to look at the checklist, the things that are going to help you prepare for the exam. The first thing that you need to know is the structure of the exam. It is very important to know how your paper is structured so that you will know how to select your questions. And then the next thing is you need to understand the concepts related to the theme, because what you will see is that in the exam paper there are different themes that will be asked, and then you're supposed to choose. Make sure that you choose a theme that you're comfortable with and that you obviously know the concept related to. And then the next thing that you'll be expected to do is to apply your skills as an historian. Those are the skills that will be used to analyze the different types of sources. Now, sources will come as photographs, they can be written sources, they can be cartoons, various sources that you'll be using. So for whatever source you're given, you have to analyze. Extract information, analyze, interpret, and then answer the question. And then the next thing is to be able to construct a coherent argument using evidence in an extended writing question. So this is where your essay writing skills come in. Those are very important in history. And please take note of the word coherent, that whatever you write, it has to be coherent. It has to make sense. Because if it doesn't make sense, then people won't understand it. Make sure that it's in chronological order as well. And then, in terms of the overview of the paper, remember I said to you before that you will be looking at the structure of the exam, so it's very important to know how your exam is going to look at the end of the year. So, we're looking at History Paper 1, and as I've already said to you, we'll be focusing on the Cold War, but I'm showing you the structure of the entire exam so that you can make an informed choice. The paper is out of 150 marks, and it's 3 hours long. Obviously, because it consists of short source analysis questions and then the essay questions. Okay, so this question paper consists of 6 questions. Now, historians, you don't have to do all 6. Remember, there is a choice. So, the first part of this exam is source-based questions. Question 1 is the Cold War. Now, the overriding question is, how did the Cold War period shape international relations after the Second World War? You already know that because that's the theme you're dealing with. But then the focus question will be the origins of the Cold War in Europe, and the Cuban crisis. So in today's lesson, we'll be focusing on the Cuban crisis. And then question 2 is independent Africa. How was independence realized in Africa in the 1960s and 70s? So the focus there will be Africa in the Cold War. So you get to choose either the Cold War or independent Africa. Again, please make sure you don't do both. And then the third question under source-based questions is civil society protests in the 1950s to 1970s. So you'll be looking at what forms of civil society protests emerged from the 1960s to 1990. In this theme, we're looking at the civil society protests in the United States and other parts of the world, not in South Africa. Please make sure that you've studied the correct theme for that. So the focus question there will be the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And then the second part of this paper, now remember I told you that there's a choice. So if I can quickly go back, source-based, there are 3 questions. You need to answer 1. You can do the Cold War or independent Africa, or you can choose civil society protests. And then you move on to the second part of this paper, which is essay writing. So question 4 will be the Cold War. The focus there will be China and Vietnam. Now what happens is that you have to choose one. These alternate annually, So it can be China this year, and then the following year, Vietnam. You need to familiarize yourselves with that as well. And then the second question, again, it's a choice. You don't do all of them, is independent Africa. You know the overriding question, how was independence realized in Africa? And there you will be looking at a comparative study of the Congo and Tanzania. Now you remember Congo adopted capitalism after independence, and Tanzania adopted or introduced African socialism. Again, that is where you need to know your concepts very well. And then the last question, which is question 6, is civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s. You know the overriding question already. What forms of civil society protests emerged from the 1960s to 1990? So again, you'll be looking at the civil rights movement and Black Power movement. And again, you choose one question there. So that is the structure of your exam paper. So you can decide now which theme you're familiar with or which one you like, and then focus on that, or maybe look at 2 to prepare yourself for the exam. And as I've already said to you, we are not going to do all of them. We're going to do the rest of the other themes in later sessions. But for today's session, we're going to look at the Cold War with a special focus on the Cuban crisis. Okay, so I've got an example of sources here and questions adapted from the 2013 February examination. And the instruction reads, this source consists of a written and a visual source. Now, I'd like to quickly underline these two. It's a written and a visual source. Okay, now that is very important because you need to be aware that even though there are different types of sources, they are based on the same thing. So you need to find things in the written source that correlate with what you see in the visual source. Again, you don't need to panic because the questions are going to guide you. Okay, now the instruction further reads, this is the sources are about the relationship between the USSR and Cuba before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So even before you read these sources and you look at the visual source, you already know that these sources are going to be about the relationship between the USSR and Cuba before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that will help you, that information will help you understand the sources so that when you analyze them, you know exactly what is going on. Now we're going to start with the written source. So again, you need to read the caption. Reading captions is very, very important in history because the captions tell you what the source is about, so that when you go to reading the question, the source, you know exactly what it's about. So let's read the caption for the written source. This extract focuses on the relationship that Cuba had with the USA and the USSR. Now, I'm not going to read the entire source with you, okay? I just want you to see, okay, this is how long it is. It's going to have information that will be used to answer the question, okay? It's about that relationship between the two. And then at the end, it does give you a source where it comes from. It says, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Brink of War by Paul J. Byrne. Now, historians don't stress about that. That is not the information at the bottom of the source. That is not the information. I'm just going to underline it so that you can all see what I'm talking about. Okay? This is not the information that you will be using when you are analyzing your sources. Because later on you might be asked questions like, is this a biased source? Or who wrote the source? Please don't say that this source was written by Paul J. Byrne, because it was not. This same source, the written source, can be found in different textbooks. This is just the textbook that the examiner got this particular source from, but it can be found in any other source as well. So what is important for you that is going to help you answer the question is again, this caption here. That information is very important, and that is what you need to take note of. Okay, so that is the written source. As I said to you, we're not going to read it together because it is long. Now I'm going to show you a visual source that goes with that. Oh, sorry, before I show you the visual source, let's look at the questions based on that written source, and then we'll go and look at the visual source. Question 1. How did Raul Castro and Che Guevara influence Cuba's foreign policy? And you can see in brackets it tells you that you have to focus on the written source. So in other words, the answer to this question is found in the written source. Make sure that you don't go and use the visual source to answer this question. Okay, so even though we have not read the source together, let's just see the answer to this question. Influenced Cuba to develop closer ties with Russia. Influenced Cuba regarding policies related to communism. Those are possible answers that are found in the source. Now, another very, very important thing you need to take note of is the mark allocation, because that tells you how much information you need to give. Okay, I'm just going to quickly circle the mark allocation here. As you can see, 1 times 2 equals 2 marks. So you just need to give 1 point. So even though I've given you 2 possible answers here, it's because different people will give different answers. You just give 1 point, then that is straight interpretation of the source. So this question is checking whether you've understood the source or not. Don't try to give something that is very complicated or your own knowledge of the event and all that. That will come at a later stage. And then we look at the next question. It says, use the source and your own knowledge. Now that is very important. In the first question, you were just using the source, so the answer was found in the source. But in this question, you are using both the source and your own knowledge. Now, in some cases, when a question like this is asked, you will be expected to use the source just to trigger your memory. A source will be a springboard for you to remember information about the event or the concept, whatever the question is. Okay, so again, I'm going to quickly underline those 2 instructions because they're very important. So you are using the source and your own knowledge. So in your response, please make sure that you have used both, because the answer will not only come from the source, but you have to have studied this section as well. So you need to know exactly what the event was about. So you need to define the concept of communism. Now remember, when we started, I told you about concepts in history. They are very, very important. So we'll be looking at more concepts as we go on and in other sessions as well. So you've been introduced to one concept now, and that is communism. So when you were studying the Cold War, your starting point should have been defining communism, defining capitalism, and then looking at the other concepts like propaganda, brinkmanship, and so on. Okay, so now you need to use your own words, because this written source is not going to have an explanation or a definition of communism. You need to show that you understand what communism was about. So both from what you've read in the source and your own knowledge as well. So again, the mark allocation is very important. 1 times 2 equals 2. So you get 2 marks for giving that definition. Okay, so again, let's look at the answer there. You can, there are various possible answers here, because we know that we all use language differently, as long as you have communicated the meaning of the concept correctly. An economic, social, and political system which aimed to create an equal society. And then you get your 2 marks. Or you can say trade and industry were controlled by the state for the benefit of the country. That means people had to share. Or you can say no private ownership was permitted. You still get 2 marks, as long as you show understanding of communism. And remember, I said to you that the written source will obviously trigger that understanding, but it will be based on your own memory as well. And then the next question is, in which country did the USA place nuclear missiles? Again, they've given you instructions there that this is from a written source. So we're not dealing with the visual source yet. So you know that you need to go to the written source, but you're also using your own information there. So in this question, again, you're just extracting information from the source. So this source is still testing your understanding of what went on. So let's look at the possible answer. But before we do that, again, look at the mark allocation there. It's 1 times 1. Okay, so the possible answer there is Turkey. And that information is found in the source. So if you've read your source properly, you will see that the answer is already there. And then, moving along, the next question is, explain whether the initial plan by the USA to get rid of Castro was a success. Okay, now this explanation is your own judgment, but it's based on the written source. I'm going to quickly underline the word explain, because those instruction words are very important in history. Because if you say describe, define, explain, we're asking you to do different things. Don't forget that. Okay, so you need to explain whether the initial the initial plan by the USA to get rid of Castro was a success. Okay, so you already know from reading the source that the USA wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro, and then the mark allocation is 2 times 2, it's 4 marks. Okay, let's look at the possible answers there. Okay, so there you can either state whether it was successful or not. The question does say, explain whether it was successful or not. Don't just write down the answer without specifying whether it was successful or not. In some cases, your answer can lead to that, but you need to show the person reading your answer that you know what you are talking about. Okay, so you can say it was successful and support your answer, but let's read the possible answer here. It was not successful. The United States was defeated at the Bay of Pigs. It was an embarrassment for the U.S. government under Kennedy. Castro and the USSR became stronger allies. And then, if you look at the marking guidelines, obviously these will not be available to you when you write the exam. They are there for the markers, but they do allow for other possible answers. It says any other relevant response. So in other words, as long as your response makes sense. Okay, I often say to the students, sometimes you can give an answer that is totally different from what the examiner was thinking, as long as you can support it. But make sure that when you're supporting it, you're not making up your own history. You give concrete evidence to support your answer. That is very important in history. And then the next question is, how would you describe the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev as shown in the visual source? Okay, so now that is looking at the visual source. So we're going to look at the visual source together. But then, if you look at this question, they're saying, how would you describe it? You are asked for your own opinion there, but it's an informed opinion, informed by what you have seen. Okay, so let's look at this visual source. Again, it's very important to read the caption. You already know that. So the visual source tells you that this is a photograph. It is not a cartoon. It's a photograph. Okay, it was taken when the event took place. I'm just going to quickly underline photograph so that you know what the source is about. This is a photograph of Fidel Castro, and it tells you who Fidel Castro is. It tells you that he is on the left. Okay, so this will be Fidel Castro. The leader of the USSR, and Khrushchev on the right, okay, the leader of the USSR. So you already know who these two people are. You don't have to panic and get confused when you're answering that question. They were hugging each other. So again, that is a clue. I'm going to quickly underline that because that is going to help you answer the question. So you can see that they are hugging each other. That's a very, very important clue because it will help you understand whether they had friendly relations or not. But then another thing that you need to look at is the visual clues. Okay, so we've looked at the written clues, that is the caption of this written source. It tells you that they were hugging each other. They were at a meeting of the United Nations in 1960 in New York. Remember, I told you that is the very important part of analyzing sources because it contextualizes the source for you. So you know exactly when this was taken, where it was taken, and what is going on. Now, you need to look at the actual photograph and see if whatever is going on in the photograph agrees with what is said in the written explanation or the caption. So it does say they're hugging each other, and as you can see them, they are hugging each other. Okay. Other visual clues that you can use to answer the question are they're laughing, they're smiling, they seem to be happy to see each other. So again, that tells you that this was a friendly relationship between the two leaders, Fidel Castro of Cuba and Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR. Okay, then when you go to the question, you know exactly what is going on and what the relations were between those two. Okay, so we've looked at that photograph and we've looked at the visual clues that are going to help you answer the question. So coming back to the question, it reads, how would you describe the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev as shown in the visual source? So again, they are asking for your own opinion, but it is based on the visual source. So in other words, you can't just make things up that are not related to the visual source. Now let's look at the possible answer here. It's that it was a cordial, good, friendly relationship. Now remember when we are analyzing the photograph, we did say that they were hugging and smiling and all that. But in this case, you are not asked to explain why. You just asked to describe the relationship. So please make sure you stick to those things that you expected to do. In some cases, they can say to you, describe the relationship and then justify by referring to the visual clues in the photograph. But in this case, you were not asked to do that. That is why the mark allocation is 1 times 2. So you only get 2 marks for saying it was a friendly relationship. And then when you're asked to justify that, then you will get more marks for it. Then that is where you'll be saying that they are really hugging each other and they're smiling and they seem to be liking each other or any relevant thing. So please make sure you read the instructions carefully. And then if we look at the next question, now this question is asking you to refer to both the written and the visual sources. Again, it's very, very important to read that instruction because when you give your answer or your response, it has to come from both. So make sure that you're not answering based only on the written source or the visual source. And then the question is, explain why Castro tried to strengthen his relationship with Khrushchev. Okay, now if you look at those two sources, remember I told you that they work together. So the written source tells you about the relations between Cuba and the USSR leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then the visual source is a visual explanation of a written source. So it is showing you in a visual form that these two leaders were friendly with each other. Okay, so you get 4 marks for saying that because you are now explaining. You are not just describing as in the previous question, but you need to explain. Okay, so let's look at the possible answer here. He needed a strong ally to protect Cuba from the United States. He looked to Russia as a trading partner. Now again, this is where your own knowledge of this theme and the event comes in. So you'll read the written source. It will have some information relating to that, but also from the lessons in class, you will know that that was the reason behind the relationship between the two countries. Okay, so what we've done, we've looked at the written and the visual source, and we've looked at the questions where you were expected to understand. So they were looking at comprehension, extract information from the source, and then make your own judgments, not in a sophisticated way, but still using information from the sources. So what we're going to do now, we're going to have a short break, and then when we come back, we are going to look at how you analyze a cartoon. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. So in this segment, we are going to look at how you analyze a cartoon. So just like the other sources we've been looking at before the break, you need to read the caption. It is there for a reason. It is there to guide you. So historians, it's very, very important to read that caption. So let's quickly read it together. It says, this cartoon by Herblock appeared in the Washington Post on 1 November 1962. So already you can see the clues there. It tells you that it was in 1962, and you will know when the Cuban Missile Crisis was. And this is the information that is going to help you answer questions later on. And then it goes on to say this was shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the examiner or the historian has contextualized this cartoon for you, so that when you go to it and you look for clues, you already know what the cartoon is about. And then it tells you what you can see in the cartoon. It says it shows John F. Kennedy on the left and Nikita Khrushchev on the right trying to contain a nuclear war. Okay, so now let's see if that is true. So they've made things very, very easy for you. They've told you exactly what is going on in the cartoon. Now you need to look at it to see if that is going on. So again, I'm just going to circle these figures so that you can see them. So the caption has already told you that this is JFK of the United States, and this is Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR. And then another thing that is a clue here is that in the box here, you've got the words written, nuclear war. Now, if you go back to the caption, it does say that they were trying to contain the nuclear war. Now, how do you know from analyzing this cartoon that they were both trying to contain it? Because they've got their hands on the lid of this box, making sure that the nuclear war does not take place. Now, when you're analyzing a cartoon is different from a photograph. It's very, very important to note that in a cartoon, every little detail is there for a reason. It is there to send a specific message. Because before a cartoonist drew a cartoon, they wanted to send you a message. They knew exactly what they wanted to say to you, or the message they wanted to convey, so they're going to use specific visuals to convey that message. It's not like a photograph, where even though the photograph shows the event, but it captures the moment. So that if this was a photograph, for argument's sake, and it was showing these two leaders, and behind them there were other leaders who had nothing to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they just happened to be there, and the photographer could not remove them, then they would appear there. That is what you need to know. But something like that will not happen in a cartoon, because a cartoonist has decided what he wants to include in a cartoon. So don't think that if there is something as small as, or that you think is as insignificant as maybe this smoke coming out of the cartoon, that is not important. It is important because it is there to convey the message. The cartoonist wants to tell us something about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he is using all those details to help you understand what was going on. And then another thing that most cartoons will have, not all of them, is that they will have their own captions as well, or their own writing. So if you look at this one, it says here, let's get a lock for this thing. So you already know from reading the caption that they were trying to contain a nuclear war, okay? And then you read the cartoon itself, they're saying, let's get a lock for this thing. So that is how they were trying to contain it. So in other words, they did not want a nuclear war to take place. So if you look at that cartoon, it's well explained and it's well structured. Now let's look at the question. The first question is, what messages does the cartoonist convey? Now remember, I told you that when you're analyzing a cartoon, you must always bear in mind that the cartoonists drew the cartoon because they wanted to tell us something. There is a specific message they wanted to convey to us. Okay, let's look at a possible answer here. So the response here can be that there was a possibility of a nuclear war. Now you already know that because there was a Cuban Missile Crisis where these two superpowers faced each other. So it was possible that a nuclear war was going to take place, but then they were trying to contain it, as the caption said. The cartoon shows the desperation of Kennedy and Khrushchev to stop the outbreak of the nuclear war. That is also straightforward because it's contained in the caption of the cartoon and the cartoon itself, where they were both saying we need to get a lock for this thing. In other words, we need to make sure that the nuclear war does not come out. And then, if you look at the next question, it says, explain the statement, let's get a lock for this thing, in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm going to read that question again because it's very important. You are explaining, okay, that is where you need to bring in your own knowledge of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but using this cartoon. So explain the statement. We've already looked at the statement where they were saying, let's get a lock for this thing. They're trying to contain the nuclear war. They don't want it to come out of the box. And you're explaining the meaning of that statement in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is where your own knowledge comes in, and obviously your understanding of the cartoon. So your cartoon analysis skills come in, but also your knowledge of the event is very important in order to understand the context. Now, if you look at the possible response here, it means that both Kennedy and Khrushchev tried to reach an agreement regarding the missile crisis in Cuba. Okay, now that information is not in the visual source itself, but you can read between the lines. You can read from the actions of the two leaders in the cartoon. And you already know from the lessons in class that they were trying to contain the nuclear war. It means that a solution needs to include both parties. So both the United States and the USSR wanted to make sure that a nuclear war did not take place. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were prepared to avoid a nuclear war at all costs. Okay, again, you already know that because they're both saying that let's get a lock for this thing. In other words, they're not saying you get a lock. We need to do it together. Make sure, we need to collectively make sure that a nuclear war does not take place. So you need to look for all those details when you're analyzing a cartoon, so that when you get to answering questions, then it becomes very easy. Okay, so we're going to take another short break, and then when I see you again, we'll be looking at a more complex, longer question. Thank you. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. So, in the other segments, we're looking at the short questions, how you analyze sources and how you answer those questions. Now, what we're going to look at is a paragraph question. So let's look at question 3. Again, as you know, this is adapted from the Department of Basic Education February exam from 2013. paper 1, we're still focusing on the Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, let's read the instruction together. It says, use all the sources. Now, that is very important because in your response, you need to make sure that you've got points from all the sources. So you use all the sources and your own knowledge. So these are the two main things. Now, you'll remember from the short questions that there were questions where you were using the sources, extracting information directly from the sources, and there were questions where you were asked to use your own knowledge as well. And then you're supposed to write a paragraph. So this is another important thing. I'm going to underline it. You write a paragraph. Now, a paragraph is not one word or one sentence. And they tell you here that it's a paragraph of about 8 lines. They do say about 8 lines. If your paragraph is longer than 8 lines, don't stress. It's not the end of the world as long as it is not too long. Don't write a page or 2 pages. It's supposed to be short. So this is just a guideline of how long your paragraph is supposed to be. Obviously, if it's 2 lines, then it can't be called a paragraph. It's just 2 sentences. That is why they've given you that guideline. Okay, and then they've also given you the guideline in terms of words. They're saying about 80 words. Now, a lot of kids waste time counting words. Don't stress about that. As long as you can see the lines that, you know, what I've written can fit in plus minus 10 lines, okay, then you'll be fine. And then the task that you have to do is to explain the role that the United States played in preventing the outbreak of a nuclear war in Cuba. Okay, I'm going to quickly underline that so that you can see. You are explaining, and you're explaining, I'm going to circle this, the role played by the United States. Now, the question is not asking you about the role played by the USSR. So when we're analyzing the short questions, we're looking at the relations between the United States and the USSR. But this question is specifically looking at the role of the United States. And they're not looking at whether the United States was responsible for the crisis or for the outbreak of the nuclear war, but they've told you that they were trying to prevent. So you're explaining the role played by the United States in preventing the outbreak of a nuclear war in Cuba. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to quickly look at the sources. Okay, we have not looked at all the sources, but I'm just going to point out important points that might help you answer this question, bearing in mind that the question is only asking for the role of the United States and not the USSR. Okay, so we'll start with our written source. Okay, this source, we've already looked at it. It focuses on the relationship that Cuba had with the United States and the USSR. Okay, as his relationship with the United States got worse, Castro's relations with the USSR improved. Okay, so they're just giving you the background about the relationship between Castro and the United States and then the USSR. Okay, and then they're giving you the context as well, how the Cuban economy depended on the US economy and so on. And then it goes on to say that the Americans had allies. I'm reading from this part because, again, we don't have time to read the entire source from here. The Americans had allies all over the Eastern Hemisphere surrounding the USSR. The United States had a huge number of military forces in Europe near the Soviet borders. So obviously that would have threatened the Soviet Union. It was well known that the United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey, which were pointed at the Soviet Union. So this obviously directs to the threat that the Soviet Union felt regarding the missiles that the United States had placed in different parts of the world. Okay, if we scroll down, Now, by the time JFK became president at the beginning of 1961, the Americans were already working on ways to get rid of Castro. We already know why. Okay, this plan ended in a disaster with the failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. We've looked at that as well. Castro and his men quickly defeated the army, and the failure was a huge embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Now, that is a clue. That is something you can use to answer this question, because it does say here that the U.S. failed to overthrow Castro. They could not take over Cuba. Okay, and it also says their failed schemes, okay, only helped to solidify or harden Castro's alliance with the USSR. So again, that should tell you why the United States would try to prevent a nuclear war, because they had already tried and failed to overthrow Castro. Okay, and then let's look at the visual source that we've already looked at when we're looking at the short questions. Already you can see that the United States will feel threatened by this relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Remember, this is the source that is showing Fidel Castro of Cuba hugging Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR. So again, you know that they would have threatened the United States. And then, if you go and look at the next source, the source consists of two extracts on actions of the USSR and the USA over the missiles in Cuba. Now, we didn't look at this source when we were looking at the short questions, but let's look at the things that might help you understand the role played by the United States. Okay, toward the end of August 1962, the CIA issued a secret report. That is an answer to your question, so you need to use that. So they issued a secret report on the activity in Cuba. And then it tells you what it noted. I'm not going to read all that. And then it says Khrushchev had cleverly orchestrated his arms build-up in Cuba. So they're telling you about the role of Khrushchev. But then if we come back to the United States, we already know, you know this from your studying this section as well, that there was the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Okay, so you need to look at the role played by this group of people. What did they do? Okay, so they carefully analyzed the results passed to them. Okay, so that is how they were trying to prevent their nuclear war. They carefully analyzed the results, because you'll remember that photographs of the installation of missiles in Cuba were taken by the United States, and then there was an emergency meeting of EXCOM where they analyzed all these things. So the US did not go straight into war with the Soviet Union over Cuba, but what they did was to have a meeting and they analyzed the reports. Okay, and then it goes on to say, by 20 October 1962, a wide array of Soviet offensive weapons had been located. Most alarming was the discovery of nuclear warhead storage bunker. Unknown at the time was the status of the warheads. Okay, so it just carries on about the discoveries that the United States got from those photographs. The EXCOM chose to believe the worst, that nuclear warheads were there. Okay, and then you look at the next extract. Remember, the instruction did say that there were two extracts. It says this extract focuses on the USA's reaction to the USSR's placement of the missiles. Okay, now the first thing that JFK did was he signed a quarantine proclamation. Okay, that is very, very important. Okay, you know what a quarantine is, a blockade. Okay, so he put a blockade into effect the next day. Again, they are not going straight into war, but they are trying other avenues so that a nuclear war does not take place. Okay, and then it goes on to tell you about the Russian ships going to Cuba and how this Khrushchev had warned the Soviet ships would not turn back. So that was his response. Okay, remember, we're not interested in the Soviet role, but we're interested in the American role. President Kennedy and other U.S. government officials feared that a Soviet submarine might try to defend the incoming ships by taking action against American warships, and that this would lead to a larger confrontation. So again, it tells you that they did not want that confrontation. They feared the confrontation. So then they're going to try and prevent it. Now let's see if there's any more information this source tells you. Okay, now what happened was that they had monitored those, okay, more than half of the ships being monitored reverse course, including those suspected of having missiles and other weapons on board. Okay, again, it goes on about Khrushchev. After the suspect ships had turned around, the Secretary of State Rusk told other ExCom members, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. So in other words, they're saying that they've got the upper hand. Okay, so that is how they were trying to prevent the nuclear war from taking place. And then we look at this cartoon that we've already analyzed. Remember, I'm not going to read the caption again because we've already done that. And we said that there is writing on the cartoon itself where both Kennedy and Khrushchev are saying, let's get a lock for this thing. In other words, they're saying, we don't want a nuclear war. Let's keep it contained in the box. And then there is a nuclear war there. So you need to go back to cartoon analysis that we've done. Okay, now let's look at the possible response to this question, bearing in mind that you are writing a paragraph and this is out of 8 marks. And the instruction, as I've already said to you, says read all the sources or use all the sources and your own knowledge to answer the question. So you need to make sure that in your response you've got points from all the sources. Okay. Now, the first thing is Kennedy and his advisors debated the matter of the invasion of Cuba. We already know that because we looked at the sources and how the United States responded. And then they opted for a blockade. We've looked at that as well, or the quarantine. I'm quickly going to underline that so that you can remember. So that is also found in the source. And then another thing that is found in the source is in his speech to the nation, he responded that the United States was going to respond by not holding back, but obviously doing something about the missiles. In other words, not allowing the Soviet Union to place those missiles. Okay, and he also made it clear that the Soviet missiles in Cuba would not be acceptable. That is why the quarantine was put in place. And then there is a source that also told you that on the 23rd of October, he signed the quarantine proclamation. So again, I said to you when we're analyzing that source, by signing it, they were trying to prevent a nuclear war. So another thing that you know from your own knowledge is that Kennedy and Khrushchev corresponded back and forth. So in other words, they were having a discussion about what was going on because they did not want to go to war against each other. And then they also had direct lines of communication. And as a result of that, on the 26th of October 1962, a non-Soviet ship was stopped and inspected to show the Soviets that the U.S. was determined to stop and search ships. Okay, that is also found in the source. And then the U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba if the Soviet Union removed the missiles. So by doing that, by coming to that agreement, they were stopping the nuclear war. They were preventing a nuclear war from taking place. So even though in this response we did include the Soviet Union as well, the focus is on the response of the United States or the role played by the United States. The Soviet Union will come in, obviously, because they were having discussions with the United States. So that is how you need to answer paragraph questions. Make sure that the information comes from all the sources and then your own knowledge. So it shouldn't be that long. So that's it for today. In our next lesson, we will be looking at essay writing. Goodbye. And then the second part of this paper. Now remember I told you that there's a choice. So if I can quickly go back, source-based, there are 3 questions. You need to answer 1. You can do the Cold War or independent Africa, or you can choose civil society protests. And then you move on to the second part of this paper, which is essay writing. So question 4 will be the Cold War. The focus there will be China and Vietnam. Now what happens is that you have to choose one. These alternate annually, so it can be China this year and then the following year Vietnam. You need to familiarize yourselves with that as well. And then the second question, again, it's a choice, you don't do all of them, is independent Africa. You know the overriding question, how was independence realized in Africa? And there you will be looking at a comparative study of the Congo and Tanzania. Now you remember Congo adopted capitalism after independence, and Tanzania adopted or introduced African socialism. Again, that is where you need to know your concepts very well. And then the last question, which is question 6, is civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s. You know the overriding. Hello, young historians. Welcome to Learn Extra Matric Exam Revision. Today we'll be focusing on the Cold War. So what I'd like to do first, I'd like us to look at the checklist, the things that are going to help you prepare for the exam. The first thing that you need to know is the structure of the exam. It is very important to know how your paper is structured so that you will know how to select your questions. And then the next thing is you need to understand the concepts related to the theme, because what you will see is that in the exam paper there are different themes that will be asked, and then you're supposed to choose. Make sure that you choose a theme that you're comfortable with and that you obviously know the concept related to. And then the next thing that you'll be expected to do is to apply your skills as an historian. Those are the skills that will be used to analyze the different types of sources. Now, sources will come as photographs, they can be written sources, they can be cartoons, various sources that you will be using. So for whatever source you are guiding question already, what forms of civil society protests emerged from the 1960s to 1990. So again, you'll be looking at the civil rights movement and Black Power movement. And again, you choose one question there. So that is the structure of your exam paper. So you can decide now which theme you're familiar with or which one you like, and then focus on that, or maybe look at 2 to prepare yourself for the exam. And as I've already said to you, we are not going to do all of them. We're going to do the rest of the other themes in later sessions. But for today's session, we're going to look at the Cold War with a special focus on the Cuban crisis. Okay, so I've got an example of sources here and questions adapted from the 2013 February examination. And the instruction reads, this source consists of a written and a visual source. Now, I'd like to quickly underline these two. It's a written and a visual source. Okay, now that is very important because you need to be aware that even though there are different types of sources, they are based on the same thing. So you need to find things in the written source that correlate with what you see in the given. You have to analyze, extract information, analyze, interpret, and then answer the question. And then the next thing is to be able to construct a coherent argument using evidence in an extended writing question. So this is where your essay writing skills come in. Those are very important in history. And please take note of the word coherent, that whatever you write, it has to be coherent. It has to make sense. Because if it doesn't make sense, then people won't understand it. Make sure that it's in chronological order as well. And then, in terms of the overview of the paper, remember I said to you before that you will be looking at the structure of the exam. So it's very important to know how your exam is going to look at the end of the year. So we're looking at history paper 1, and as I've already said to you, we'll be focusing on the Cold War, but I'm showing you the structure of the entire exam so that you can make an informed choice. The paper is out of 150 marks and it's 3 hours long. Obviously, because it consists of short source analysis questions and then the essay questions. Okay, so this question paper consists of 6 questions. Now, historians, you don't have to do all 6. Remember, there is a choice. So, the first part of this exam is source-based questions. Question 1 is the Cold War. Now, the overriding question is, how did the Cold War period shape international relations after the Second World War? You already know that because that's the theme you're dealing with. But then the focus question will be the origins of the Cold War in Europe, and the Cuban crisis. So in today's lesson, we'll be focusing on the Cuban crisis. And then question 2 is independent Africa. How was independence realized in Africa in the 1960s and 70s? So the focus there will be Africa in the Cold War. So you get to choose either the Cold War or independent Africa. Again, please make sure you don't do both. And then the third question under source-based questions is civil society protests in the 1950s to 1970s. So you'll be looking at what forms of civil society protests emerged from the 1960s to 1990. In this theme, we're looking at the civil society protests in the United States and other parts of the world, not in South Africa. Please make sure that you've studied the correct theme for that. So the focus question there will be the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement.